What is supply chain risk? Simply put, what we're looking at with supply chain risk is understanding the risk posed by the use of a third party across your ecosystem, whether or not that's through providing business processes, business services, technology, managing data, managing operations on your behalf. But ultimately, whoever that is not part of your business that's accessing these key data sources, essentially. We've been considering supply chain risk and the assessment associated to supply chain for a long time. The only difference at the moment is the change in technology, the change in available services by third parties. And what that means is that the supply chain risk is ever growing. So we're continually looking at how do we reassess and understand the risk associated to these third parties. Just understanding your business. This is really key for so many reasons, not just managing your supply chain, managing risk, managing your security landscape, managing the controls that you put in place to protect things that matter to you, but understanding your business process, what truly is important to your organization, what things could go wrong is really key to understanding risk. Getting the right visibility of your third parties is also key. There was a survey done a couple of years ago where hundreds and hundreds of third parties were being used inside organizations, and most organizations would have a clear understanding of a small percentage of those. So we're really looking at here is how do we gain enough visibility across our third party landscape so that we can ask the right questions. And that leads us into this transparency component. More and more we're asking more and more of our third parties to understand the true risk they pose. And having the right transparency, the right conversations with our third parties to be able to understand and assess that risk is really, really key. The nth party, what we're trying to talk about here is our third party ecosystem. So the people we work directly, they also have a bunch of third parties, and their third parties then have a bunch of third parties. So the concept of really truly understanding a supply chain risk could extend beyond your direct third party, and being able to appropriately capture some of that information and use that to assess your risk posture is really, really key. That becomes a bit more prevalent with some of the regulation changes with CPS 230 and the introduction of the fourth party assessment process. Being unprepared. We've seen this quite often, the lack of process to understand that risk associated to the third parties. While having a risk management process in place, tailoring that process to cater for what is different with the third party assessment process is really key. And what I mean by that is we're not looking to change the risk management process. We're looking to put in or define the right parameters of which you want to assess these third parties to align to your risk appetite and your risk processes. The supply chain itself is relatively straightforward. It's like many other practices of onboarding something, being able to manage that through the duration of its life cycle, whether or not that's through contractual basis or otherwise, and an appropriate process to offboard. And that practice that is developed as part of that onboarding process can be used for other means as well. We're speaking quite heavily here around the supply chain risk, the vendor risk. But when you're looking at how do you introduce something new into the organization that you may not have full control over, this process could be leveraged there as well. So the extension of that onboarding process could resolve risk associated to bringing on new technologies, just the technology itself, and being able to apply the same lens across that risk posture and what that means to the organization. Moving through that life cycle, managing starts to introduce some metrics, starts to introduce how do we make sure that we have the right inputs to understand that our risk is understood, it is defined, it is appropriately assessed, and we have the right level of appetite and mitigations to manage that risk ongoing. Those metrics can vary. There could be a combination of service level agreements with third parties. It could be appropriate reporting that they provide to you so that you can continue to manage and understand the risk they pose to you. A lot of that will be driven through introduction of requirements through contracts, of course, But there could be other metrics that could be used as part of that ongoing working relationship with that third party, and having regular catch-ups with critical third parties to ensure that they are continuing to do the right thing by your risk appetite. To round that out, the key thing with the offboarding piece is making sure that whatever that vendor or third party had access to has been restored and returned to yourselves. By being able to manage the right offboarding piece through contractual agreements, through arrangements so that your data and access to systems has been returned or revoked, is really key to ensure that your key assets are no longer vulnerable post engagement with the supplier or third party. Each of those steps has elements of managing risk. And why we have risk essentially baked into each of those sections is things change. The onboarding piece, we may have an initial assessment, services may change over time, and we need to reassess the risk associated to using that third party. So that risk process of understanding what it truly means to us, i.e. picking up something like the inherent risk, understanding what controls we may have in place to manage that inherent risk, aligning to a new residual risk against our appetite, so our business appetite for utilizing those services, and whether or not there's any further action needed or any other mitigations needed to achieve a target state. Naturally, if we have a residual risk outside of appetite and not achieving a target state, we're going to add more mitigations or controls to lower that risk posture. When we're looking at controls to mitigate risk, we're looking at across everything: technology, process, and of course, people. And people is a really important area to focus on, and sometimes, unfortunately, it does get forgotten. So having the risk and the mitigation process, again, aligned to your risk management framework, baked into the supply chain, provides that ongoing awareness and understanding of risk. What to consider. So when we're engaging with our third parties, having a clear understanding of the vendor, the services they're providing, what they do as part of that service, and whether or not it introduces new technology, it introduces new process, introduces new people into that operation. So when we're starting to paint that picture of that vendor, being really clear that the process that we're asking them to do is going to provide access to personal information, then our posture and our risk assessment process may also change and adapt to ensure that we're putting the right protections in place around that third party. That's probably one of the really key ones I think gets missed quite often, is being really clear at the start of what that vendor is going to be doing for us, and being really clear from our internal perspective of what we expect from that vendor and what we expect them to have access to. And that could be considerations around, does that person touch member data? Does it touch personal information? Does it have key access to our important systems? All the way down to a level of support around our office or a catering company that we may have used once off. All of these different vendors should be, as we've spoken about, should be assessed. And the assessment piece is almost like a triage initially, understanding what level they fall into. And then based on those levels, we undertake that third-party risk assessment. And that's where the effort changes. So when we're defining our tiering, and we'll have to run through this a few times to make sure that we've tiered the right vendors appropriately and it makes sense. What that then leads to is the risk assessment piece can be also associated and tiered to those tiered structure that we've just spoken about. So when we're looking at critical, naturally, there's going to be more rigor associated to those. And the effort can vary depending on the complexity of the service they provide and the detail of their responses. But we could be looking at some days of effort to appropriately risk assess a third party of that magnitude. As we tier the assessment process, we'll naturally be looking at less controls or just focusing on the most important controls, therefore reducing the effort as we go down the different tiers. And depending on, again, your risk appetite, you might get to a point where you've decided that the lowest tier, you're not going to really do anything because of the risk associated to what they do, what systems and data they access. And it might be just a business decision that if a vendor is tiered tier 4, then we won't be doing anything else at that time. So again, establishing that tiering process and the different control sets that you want to assess against is really key. Otherwise, if you've got 100, 150, 200 vendors, if you're assessing them all against all of your controls, you'll also hit a point where these vendors just won't have the answers. So the time expended to ask these types of in-depth questions becomes less valuable. So I'd be looking at those types of metrics and practices to ensure that the effort is not unduly expended on the wrong areas. And you're really focusing on those key high-risk critical processes first and foremost. Establishing minimum requirements is really, really key as well. This will feed into your onboarding process. This will feed into your contractual conversations. But essentially, we're defining these minimums to ensure that at the very beginning, the right checks and balances are happening with our vendors. And they understand the expectations we have of them to essentially protect the operations and the data that they will be engaging with. A big piece to consider when we are looking at our vendors, and again, feeding back into that, primarily that onboarding and managing process as part of the life cycle, is being able to properly define what information we need and what information we can get access to from our vendors. The appropriate information of how you want to manage that relationship, that assessment piece with the third parties, and what level of comfort you have with the information that they may be able to provide. When we're looking at components of what appropriate information means, it's really to give you enough comfort that what the vendor is saying, i.e. describing the controls that they have implemented, giving you enough assurance and understanding that the appropriate controls either A, exist and are operating effectively. Again, when we get to that assessment process, it's really, really important that we are using the right information to make the right risk determination. And being able to understand how they are protecting your data when using it as part of a service they're offering is really crucial. What we've got on the screen at the moment is really a high-level mud map of where to start to understand risk, starting with that business process, starting with undertaking a business impact analysis, for example. Putting the time in to understand what matters to the business is really, really important. Understanding what's critical upfront, what dependencies may those critical processes have, the type of information that they may hold, the technologies, the stakeholders involved, all to understand what could go wrong, what could happen to our organization if process A stopped. And being able to appropriately articulate not just the processes themselves, but that assessment process to understand, is this process A, critical to us? Is process B more critical to us? How do we then manage those throughout our operations? Helps us determine where to expend effort. So I do stress spending time understanding that piece and moving it all the way through to get to a point where at the end of your business process assessment or your BIA, have realistic and practical contingency plans in place. And it doesn't mean you've got necessarily the playbooks and all of the key documentation to run incidents at this stage. What I'm suggesting is you've got a good understanding that if something went wrong with that process, you've got a contingency of steps to follow to make sure that the outcome of that process is minimally impacted. And that concept feeds into everything going forward to the right and ultimately to your risk processes below. So once defining that business process, the key thing is mapping or understanding what you have. And what I mean by that is understanding your key assets associated to your business processes. And those assets could be people, they could be technology, they could be data or information assets. They more likely are going to start being third-party vendors that will be key to some of these business processes. So truly understanding and mapping out those assets is really key. That will again connect critical business processes with critical assets or the crown jewels of the organization, and then give you something to work off of about truly assessing that risk. So without really understanding those two elements, you may not truly paint the right risk picture. We do call out the creation or the development of a third-party risk management framework. But the intention of this document is not to replace the enterprise risk management framework. In other words, it's really a supporting document to just define the processes that will follow and define the supplier chain risk lifecycle so that we've got practical steps to follow when engaging, when onboarding, when assessing, when managing, when ultimately offboarding a third party. Why it's slightly separate is that the enterprise risk management framework will take care of the definitions. It'll take care of, we have our impact ratings, we have our likelihood ratings, we have our risk appetites defined. And the third-party risk management framework will leverage all of those elements as part of the risk assessment piece when looking at our third parties. But it wraps around some other guidance and parameters for assessing our third parties more specifically. So that's a really kind of key procedural document to define, because that will drive an understanding across the entire business and making sure that everybody in the business is clear on what they need to do when engaging third parties. Once we've got the top three defined and established, then we can start moving into really the risk assessment piece and the managing of risks. The third-party risk assessment process, again, will be defined as part of the third-party risk management framework, but ultimately it'll leverage your risk assessment process from your enterprise risk framework. Again, using the same terminology, the same appetites, the same ratings to assess that third party. The only difference that may happen is when we're looking at our third parties, we may have specific controls and, again, requirements that we've defined that we want to assess against. So really looking at the risk posed of a third party that provides a service where they're going to be directly interacting with our systems and data, for example, all the way through to assessing a technology that we may leverage as part of our operations. So the controls that we want to look at may vary to ultimately assess that third party and its suitability of using through our organization. That third party risk assessment, a bit like we described in the life cycle, depending on the risk rating and depending on what our appetite is for accepting third parties, we still may want to introduce a risk treatment process. And that may be in the form of more robust contractual arrangements with our third party. It may introduce an increased monitoring process internally to ensure that our third party is operating as we expect. And it may mean that we have more robust treatment plans in regards to assessing those third parties as well, to ensure that their control framework is aligned to what we are looking for on an ongoing basis. So that risk treatment piece can vary depending on what we discover and understand of that third party. We may or may not need to introduce new controls to manage the risk associated with accepting a third party. And as always, looking at the regular review process. This is not just the risks, but this is also going back to that business context, what we're asking for of that vendor. Has anything in our environment changed, such as key assets and key critical processes? Do we need to update our risk management process? Have we made it too complex to assess all of our third parties appropriately? Do we need to tailor that to suit our organization? And you probably won't get this perfect for your business off the bat. So that regular review, always critiquing this process is really important. Otherwise, assessing your full third-party landscape might be unwieldy and it'd be just too overwhelming to manage appropriately each year. So that review cycle is really key. And again, looking at your risk, has it changed? And how do I then look to communicate this change through the organization? One thing that's not on here that's useful and should be considered is how do we report and communicate risk internally? And this goes through not just internal teams up to executive, but also our consideration around how do we look to appropriately report our risk status, our risk posture to board as well. So once we've gone through these steps, we should be in a good position to start providing context to executive and board about our risk positioning.